Thank you for joining this panel on how transit agencies are integrating ride sourcing and public transportation. Again, I'm Brian Dugan. I'm with the Reno Gazette-Journal, and I'll be moderating this panel. Please welcome our panelists, and please hold your applause until the end of our introductions here. I have Michael Lambert here to my left. He's the administrator and assistant to the general manager for the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority in Boston. I have Jameson Otten, the chief of regional service delivery and innovations for the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority. I have Allison Wiley, the Transportation and Mobility Policy Associate of Uber Technologies in New York. And I have Guowei Turing, the Director of Mobility Innovation at the Federal Transit Administration in Washington, D.C. So please welcome our panelists this morning. So before we begin our discussion, some quick background. The public transportation in the U.S. is on a precipice of major change, driven both by technology and evolving demands of the public. For many in the public transportation sector, creating partnerships with ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft have led to new services and efficiencies. The partnerships have also created many questions as agencies navigate these new waters. Our goal in this session is to provide an update on recent experiences and best practices while we seek to interpret trends and new directions. So I wanted to start with a group question, and let's start broad. Is the definition of public transportation changing? And how much has changed in the last 5 years? And what will public transportation look like 5 years from now? Let's start with Michael.
Well, I think I can assure you that our paratransit services will look different much sooner than 5 years out. I think we are beginning to see real significant change. These are while the changes now are sort of at the margin. I know with our service in Boston, we're going to start seeing those changes seep into our regular service more and more regularly, and I think. Our customers are going to come to expect and demand more flexible service.
Jason?
I would agree. I think that you're seeing it change now, and you're seeing it change probably 2 days from now as well. As new on-demand services and new business models come online, you'll start to see modes used in different ways or really centered in ways where they're most efficient and where they're most effective. I also think that the riding public is going to really demand and continues to demand modes and services that are tailored to their needs and support the overall way that we live life today. So I think we get less mode specific and really focus on transporting the person.
Allison?
I would definitely agree. I think transportation has changed so rapidly in the last few years. I'd say the time that it changed this rapidly was the automobile. So I think ride sharing is a really exciting part to help extend kind of the reach of public transportation to underserved areas. We're seeing really exciting things in London, for example. One of the most efficient modes of transportation, the London Tube. Just last year, the Transport for London extended the tube to night hours during the weekday and also the weekend. And what we saw was really interesting from Uber's standpoint. We saw kind of this natural experiment where rides picking up riders from the core of London decreased, but we saw an overall kind of increase in rides in general, and these rides were in the kind of outer boroughs of London. So we saw riders getting on the tube late at night and then relying on Uber to get home that last 3 or 4 miles home. So that's really exciting. It's kind of ride sharing coming into the puzzle of public transportation. I think we can, and we are working together with public transportation, but I think there are a lot of opportunities to do more.
I would agree with all my fellow panelists said the observation, and my own take is depending on how we actually define public transportation. So if our definition of public transportation is based on its appearance, it will change 5 years from now, 10 years from now, depending on the technology, the enablers, the new ideas, it will continue to look different. However, if we look at public transportation as its mission, our mission is to serve public mobility needs, that will remain the same regardless of the technology evolution.
I'd like to also, thank you for the answers, everyone. I'd also like to extend to the audience, there are 2 microphones in the center aisle here. If you have a question, please step up to the microphone. I will try to get to them throughout this session. I wanted to get to back to Michael here, and while it's been a couple months since the MBTA partnered with Uber and Lyft for demand response services, that partnership has attracted a lot of attention, and especially as it relates to those demand response services. Can you give us an overview of that partnership and how it's working right now in the Boston area?
Sure. Our partnership grew out of both a success and a failure in Boston. Our success is our base paratransit service, which we refer to as the Ride. That service predates the ADA and as such has always had a sort of a social service mission. And that has meant that both the span and scope of the service have been very wide. We cover 60 cities and towns, almost 700 square miles, almost 8,000 trips a day. And that has sort of set us on an unsustainable course in terms of cost. We're around $50 a trip. And we're on pace for our paratransit system to eclipse the total cost of our bus service. And bus carries as many people in 2.5 days as we do all year. So it was clear that we needed to do something and do something fast. So our goals were to offer a trip that cost us less, that offered the customer more flexibility, but also provided us with the data that we could then use to evaluate the program and ensure its integrity. Our failure was we started first with taxi, as that was the more standard paratransit subsidy program. But because in the Boston area, taxis are overseen locally, it was very hard to achieve those goals. It was hard to get data out in a way that was not administratively overburdensome. And so then we looking at those goals, we turned to the TNCs and realized that both Uber and Lyft and other startups were set up perfectly to meet those goals. And so we began talking to both Uber and Lyft, which I think was a critical component of getting to a successful pilot. Both companies came to the table with different strengths and different ideas. And so we've been up and running since basically October. We've got 1,000 customers in the pilot and have completed about 20,000 trips.
And you've seen costs go down as a result of that, correct?
Yeah, so the program is set up where a customer pays the first $2 of any trip. We will pay up to the next 13, and then the customer pays anything over and above the $15 ride. That has meant for us an average trip cost of about $9 as opposed to $50, as I said. And even for our customers, even though they are occasionally going beyond the $15 mark, even our customers are paying less than they would have to take the ride for a same-day trip.
Sure. And I'd like to kind of piggyback on this a little bit, and just for the panel, as you know, as these partnerships grow, and you know, over time, more and more areas will have these partnerships with companies like Uber and Lyft. How do public transit organizations assure that, you know, people from all walks of life, especially people with disabilities, have access to these services? You know, how do public transit agencies assure equity across the board as these partnerships grow?
Is that to me?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. So that's one thing that we had the bridge pilot earlier this year, and in last year as well. And that's one of the issues that we addressed head on. When we started the pilot, we were planning the pilot, we had several conversations with FTA, and they were able to really help us kind of migrate through that. In that pilot, we did have several accessible vehicles. Our concern was to make sure that the level of service was the same, whether it was an accessible vehicle or not, in terms of response time, in terms of trip distance or trip time. What we found through that pilot was we never got any calls for the accessible vehicle. So we went back and we thought about that, and one of the things that grew out of that program was we started a program called Ride KC Freedom last week, which is similar to Michael's. We are working with taxi cabs and TransDev to provide that service, and it allows same-day service at a lower cost than our traditional paratransit model. We decided to start there from our disabled community as being the core and work out. So there's a component of that program that allows folks who are not through our ADA eligibility certification process to use that service as well. They don't get a subsidized trip. What comes back actually is a 5% of their fare comes back to the authority, so we can put that towards plowing more service on the street. So when we look at these partnerships, our goal really is we have something to teach the private sector as well, right? Things relating to equality, where we lay our service out, access. And those are the components that we as agencies have to watch and make sure that they're being taken into consideration throughout any of our partnerships.
Allison, I'd be curious to hear from Uber's perspective as far as the fleet goes, when partnering with a local transit agency, how do you assure that there are like wheelchair accessible vehicles?
Yeah, so I think, so Uber is about 6.5 years old, fairly young company. I think we have a long way to go in terms of our wheelchair accessible vehicle programs. This year, we're rolling out several pilot programs across the country. I think about a dozen cities will be receiving this pilot. And basically, the model of ride sharing is so different from traditional transportation models. It relies on driver partners to bring their own vehicle onto the platform. So there's a challenge there to kind of have enough supply in terms of how many wheelchair accessible vehicles there are in the supply. So we have been experimenting with a few different models, working with commercial entities to kind of work with their drivers and their vehicles to ensure a certain number of wheelchair accessible vehicles in that city. We're also working with the traditional P2P model where we're relying on drivers to come to us and they get paid incentives for doing this service. But that there are a lot of challenges in that, and I'm not going to say that we are doing a great job right now. We're not. And I think working with public transit agencies to learn about how we can be better is something we're very interested in. But it's a challenge. I think one thing that technology has done in terms of ride sharing is we have we've built features into the app, voiceover for the blind. There's a Braille version there's a phone that you can have with Braille, so blind people can be using the app. Deaf drivers or hard of hearing riders can also use the app. So we're doing a lot to provide transportation options and features to different communities, but there's a long way to go, and I think working with public transit, who definitely are the experts in this, is something we're very interested in doing.
I'd like to continue down this road a bit from Uber's perspective. That while Uber can learn a lot from the public transit organization that it partners with, what is Uber's view of public transit organizations? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What is Uber seeing?
So Uber's mission is to provide reliable, affordable transportation options to everyone, everywhere. I think public transit is definitely a partner. That's how we view public transit, and we view high capacity, massive, or public transit to be a part of kind of the future that we envision, which is shared mobility, kind of more efficient use of roads and land space, and I think in that same vein, we're working to improve the environment. We're working to kind of reduce congestion, provide transportation to people with ambulatory disabilities and other disabilities, and all keeping it affordable. And I think this is also in line with public transit's mission. I think working hand in hand with public transit is something that we are very interested in, even as we look to the future of self-driving vehicles, for example. I think one weakness of public transit, I think, is kind of in rural areas and more undeveloped areas. There's not a huge reach there. Sometimes public transit doesn't cover those areas. So Uber and Lyft and ride sharing, I think, can play a huge role here in extending the reach of public transportation to these kind of underserved communities. I think a Brookings report recently said an average person can reach 30% of the jobs in their city given 90 minutes of public transit. And that's quite lower in other metro areas, in some metro areas. So I think in terms of economic opportunities, Uber and Lyft and ride sharing kind of have entered the scene and created these opportunities for people to send their child to maybe a better school have more flexibility built into their everyday schedule. So, say they want to take the pressure off the roads in the morning, get to work quicker via public transportation, they can do that. Say they need to leave early to pick up a child from school, they can rely on Uber to do that. So there's this mixed modality that we're really excited about, and working with public transit to kind of jump into that.
Wei, I wanted to loop you in here too, to talk about where the industry is going, generally speaking. So you are in charge of the DOT's Mobility Sandbox demonstration grants, which are working on new ways to provide access to these services, right? Can you give us a few examples of these experiments right now? You said you have about 11
Sure. 11
transit
projects.
organizations with these grants. Can you, again, just give us a broad overview?
Absolutely. So for those of you who are not that familiar with the sandbox, so it's effort that FTA put up last year. The intent is to create that learning opportunity that collectively as an industry, public transportation providers, our private mobility service solution providers, as well as FTA. How do we actually better take advantage of this evolving, emerging mobility ecosystem, as Mr. White mentioned during yesterday's opening remark? So what we have done is at FTA, we roll out this opportunity called MOD, Mobility on Demand. Some people say it's MOD, sandbox. So first of all, let me just very quickly why we use the terminology sandbox. We want to use the word sandbox to convey the idea it's a space that we created, and we want people to play, to be creative, to be innovative, come in to find your partners, to collaborate, to share resources. There's no wrong way to play, there's no one way to play, and we all want to learn from this opportunity, which we call sandbox. So when we put up, FTA put up the sandbox, purposely we say, in order to maximize learning, we want to minimize requirement. Again, for those of you who actually appreciate that you take time to actually look at the opportunity that we rolled last year, we tried to minimize the requirement. So the two things that I can just jump over my mind is you have to be provider of public transportation to take the lead, and then you have to have a 20% cost match. Other than that, pretty much everything that we want you to hear from you, you propose what's your logical mobility on demand concept that you determine, the partners that you want to partner with, that you determine can benefit to promote mobility in your own community. So with that in mind, you think about that, the door is wide open. There's a variety of partners, the solutions that you may use. And indeed, we received 78 applications out of this opportunity. And a total request for that sandbox last year was $57 million. And the amount of funding that we have FTA last year was 8. So as you can envision, a lot of great ideas, innovative partnerships, business models. We just don't have enough money to fund. However, we try our best to select, out of the 78, we were able to select 11. 11 projects actually, again, the idea is learning, right? So we don't want to necessarily invest all our $8 million to learn one thing or one business model or one partnership. We try to diversify, but we want to make sure that we have a strong enough proposal to give us reasonable chance to learn. When I say learn, it could be you learn from success and you learn from failures as well. That's the whole concept of sandbox. When you think about a sandbox, that when kids play, well, adults probably play in it sometimes if you want to. You play in the sandbox, sometimes things will not work well, right? You build whatever you're building, it may collapse. What we hope is if any particular ideas that is not a good idea will fail fast. We still learn from the failure, then we move on. Because this mobility ecosystem is very dynamic. New ideas come in, bad ideas fly out of the window, and new solutions pop in this week, and the solutions that came out last month probably went out of business next week. So how do we capture those? Go back to the 11 project. The one thing that we learned from the 70A, because that actually represents what community have in mind in terms of mobility on demand, this mobility ecosystem as far as that goes. The most common idea is fall in line of how we actually, public transportation agency, leverage existing mobility solution or existing mobility services. Could be TNCs, could be car sharing, bike sharing, different variety of choices. How we actually leverage that for first mile, last mile, that's very common. ADA paratransit, new demand response services, or use that to supplement services that we kind of struggle to meet the need. Late night service, weekend service, those underserved areas. So this is one area that we actually seen pretty common from the 78. Another area that I wasn't really quite expecting, but it actually came out pretty strong, is social carpooling. Right? It's not a traditional carpooling. You get matched. Michael get matched with Mary, and then you work, the same or close, and you work to the same place or close place, and you carpool. That's prearranged. But social carpooling is really kind of dynamic, right? So you may ride with somebody else in, and then you with somebody else back to your residence. And the social carpooling, how do you enable that? Obviously, you will enable through technologies. Some proposals provide incentives. That incentives could be some sort of gamification, kind of incentivize you to wanting to social carpool. And some of them would use the social carpool to provide guaranteed parking as an incentive. Also as a way to manage insufficient parking supply as a connection to public transportation. So that's very popular. That's idea that came out, and also work with employers to resolve that, to put out that social carpooling ideas. And other ideas will include the open data, like a GTFS. How do we, I use the GTFS as an example. It's not necessarily GTF. How do we actually use GTFS to accommodate the evolving mobility space where we have new solutions? This idea of bike sharing. How do you actually use public transportation, integrate with the bike and through an integrated payment system? Let me see if anything that that's pretty much cover what we learned from, well, majority of them we learned from the 70 applications.
I think it's worth remarking from a transit agency's point of view, what a dramatic shift in attitude and approach that represents for the FTA, which is traditionally a very conservative organization, as we know. And I think that if the shift in increasing the modality, increasing of non-dedicated vehicles is to go well, FTA is going to need to maintain that focus, maintain that level of support for us as we move forward, and so we can work as partners and make sure that our customers receive good service, equal service, and safe service.
James, can you comment on your experience too in Kansas City about what you learned and what you are still learning with these partnerships?
Sure. The first thing we learned was have a service that's easy for customers to understand, what it is and what it does. But I think the other piece that we learned is that we've got to get service on the street in a quicker fashion than our traditional way of doing things. And there's a procurement process in place, and there's a reason why it's there, and it does well. However, an 8 to 10 month cycle to get things on the street may not be as enticing to an Uber or a Lyft. So we have to look at ways on how we can get ideas into the agency quicker and analyze those quicker and get those to the street quicker. One of the things that we did with Bridge was we used all local funds. So that allowed us to get to the street a little bit faster. I also think that, again, making sure that there's a good two-way communication between the public sector and the private sector with your partners on what does success look like, right? So you're driving to the same goals, and also understanding that there's two different perspectives that are going on, early in the relationship. And you have to recognize those, and those aren't bad, right? From the private sector, profit's not a bad word, right? If we're going to put this puzzle together, the private sector has to be successful. The public sector has to make sure that we're doing things efficiently, that we're being good stewards of public money, and that we're making things accessible, that we're helping to create an even playing field. So those are some of the things that we learned in Kansas City, and those are the things that we're carrying forward. I will also say that the other leg to the stool in our experience has been the business community. So the business community looked at Bridge and said, hey, you know what, this may be a little confusing to understand, but we want something like it. So that's opened up a complete dialogue with our Chamber of Commerce on what does a jobs access program in Kansas City look like that can beat those numbers in that Brookings report, and that's where we're moving now. So how we see it is really, we've heard of transit as a backbone or as a spine, but I heard it put a little differently. It's really your transit are your arteries, and the pieces that connect to that, the last mile services, your micro transits, are your capillaries. And that's what we're trying to do in getting people to a location, to get them the jobs, to use a lower cost method to get them that last mile. And I think it's all about those connections, how you make those connections and you make it seamless for people to get from A to B, and they understand how to use it, and you define it in terms that the business community also knows what success looks like, and then you have a bunch of partners that you never had before. That's the dynamic that we're starting to see in Kansas City. A lot of people say, hey, what are you doing with Bridge in the middle of the country, right? Well, there's been so much change in our organization where everything was aligned, from the board level to executive management, wanting to figure out how do we provide service in a different way. And we understand that things work in San Francisco, and they work in Boston, and they work in New York in a different way than how they work in Kansas City. And we learned that through Bridge as well. So that's been the migration, what Guo was talking about. If you fail fast, learn from that and go forward. It's almost like baseball. When batters are looking at a pitcher and they're watching the tendencies of that pitcher, they may strike out the first couple times, they may foul out, they may get a single, but eventually they learn from that past experience, and that turns into hits. So that's what the dynamic is with the sandbox. That's what the dynamic is in Kansas City, I'm sure in Boston as well, in terms of how do we deliver service in the manner that customers are expecting it today.
I'd like to kind of further the idea that you just shared about, so you have private companies partnering with public companies, and you have similar goals, right? We want to get people from A to B, but you also have different sort of underlying motives as well, profit-driven versus public service. How do you marry those two, kind of sometimes almost competing ideas, but not really? And how do you, and for everyone out here on this panel, how going forward with what we're all learning right now, do we ensure that access to these services will be affordable going forward? Not just now, but well into the future. How are these partnerships going to be sort of managed to keep that in mind?
The edict from our customers was very clear. Just don't mess up the service. They liked Uber and Lyft already. They wanted us to enter into the partnership in as hands-off a manner as possible. And so we listened to them, and we involved our customers in the development of the procurement process. And then we let that procurement process, very much as you mentioned, be flexible and be a lot less prescriptive than a typical public sector procurement. We basically just required background checks, levels of insurance, age of vehicles, and ensured that companies that were submitting responses had the capacity to provide the trips. Anything else, the respondents were allowed to suggest how to set up the program, how to design the program. We allowed ourselves to partner with multiple companies, obviously, and that so that sort of give and take between our non-negotiables and our customer base, and the aggressiveness and the sort of innovation at the core of the ride-sharing companies really produced a strong partnership.
I agree with Michael. I think our core, what we do is connect people to opportunities. And I think as agencies, we have to continue to do that. That has to be forefront. And things that take away from that, you kind of have to set them aside. One of the things that we looked at was, where do we introduce on-demand services? We have a profile of early adopters. right? But that profile might not match the communities where our service covers. So we have to make a choice. Do we try it in these communities, or do we just try it in what matches the profile? From the private sector point of view, that's an easy decision, right? From the agency point of view, it's an easy decision as well. We're going to cover both areas, right? And then we're going to measure and see how we can tweak and make sure that that access is available for both. So I think really staying committed to your core philosophy on what the agency is there to do, and putting in context the different means in which you can do that, and making sure you're still driving towards that connection. I think that's the way it has to happen. There has to be a little, again, it's the connection points. So there has to be little adjustments on either side, but compromising access to the individuals in which we serve is not an equation from our standpoint.
Allison, from your perspective.
Yeah, I think in terms of affordability, ride sharing, just the efficiency of ride sharing, where you're no longer standing around hailing a ride. Rides are costing so much less because of because part of the efficiency. I think with Uber Pool, just in terms of innovation, we're always working to innovate to create more efficient technologies that are more affordable for riders and also better for the environment and for cities. I think, as you were both mentioning, to square the two, I think our mission is a reliable, affordable ride for everyone, everywhere. And I think working with public transit is a way to achieve that. I think public transit is the backbone of getting someone from point A to point B in cities. And I think Uber and ride sharing can only work to improve and make that more of a foreseeable reality. So I think just in terms of affordability, we want to kind of work through innovations to make rides more affordable, more efficient, cleaner, safer, and so that's kind of our mission. And we are a business, so we are trying to make a profit as well. But I think we're very focused on providing those rides for everyone, working with public transit. So yeah.
Go away from your perspective.
Yes, from the higher level, I have to say, a higher level view. Transit industry that we work with public transportation providers, we work with private sector all the time. It's not the first time that we work with private sector partners. We purchase vehicles, we purchase equipment, we purchase services, and like Reno, this is starting the concept of a payment as a service. Right? So we consider this mobility solution as a service. How do we, obviously partnership has to be something for everyone, right? So that's how the partnership was sustained. On the more detailed level, that's precisely what we want to learn from the sandbox as an opportunity to, knowing that a partnership going in between public and private sector, and on the public sector side, and accessibility and equity has always been a core value for us to provide public transportation services. And on the private sector side, and you have a mission, like you pointed out, and also the bottom line is important. And it's just the nature of a private business, and it doesn't preclude us from working together productively. Again, ultimately what's more important is whether or not the people we all try to serve get a better service. That's the key. So, and then that requires different strategies. That's the brain power that from the FTS side, we like to learn from the local communities, from those sandbox projects. And once that's proven, that's successful, that turn out to be very constructive partnership, we want to make that knowledge known to the entire industry.
I think I have an audience question.
Steve Smith, Charlotte Area Transit Systems. As you look to marry the public and private sector, the public sector is guided by FTA rules, ADA requirements. How would Uber or Lyft or other agencies that we work with look to educate, train, or even certify drivers who are going to be transporting passengers? And there's a difference between I'm getting an Uber ride to go from A to B. One of the big topics that we're looking at is the first mile, last mile. And I've heard you talking about it, but I haven't heard it addressed. And where we talk about education, what if a special needs folks is there and a driver's not there? So the question is how do we look for best practices from the FTA and guidelines that we can go by so that when we interact locally with an Uber or with a Lyft, we can ensure that our riders' rights aren't violated.
I'll jump in quickly on that. I think, as I mentioned previously, we have a lot of room to go in terms of accessibility. I think the pilots that we are working on this year are focusing on your question on how we can ensure supply, how we can ensure a supply of vehicles, but also drivers who meet the ADA requirements. And it's a really challenging kind of piece for us because of just the model of ride sharing is so different from traditional transportation. I think what we're seeing as the most effective right now, but I think we're looking for other ways as well, is partnering with commercial entities to provide the drivers and provide the vehicles. So these aren't our traditional P2P driver partners who use the platform. And I think we're trying to figure out what is the right balance of having these commercial partners, but also our traditional P2P partners. It's also kind of working on incentives on our side to make this a attractive option for people seeking work on the platform. So these are monetary incentives, and they kind of run the gamut of things that we're kind of piloting across the country. But I totally hear you. I think it's something that is extremely important, obviously. But I think working with the FTA and public transit is something that will be very beneficial for us, so we can learn and get better. But totally hear you on that.
Yeah, if I may make a clarification, from the FTA standpoint, that we don't promote necessarily all agencies across the board start going out to find partners and any partners that you can find and start working together. What we're trying to do is to find out is what FTA needs to do, so we enable provider of public transportation can consider other mobility services or solutions as potential options. What FTA rules and regulations and requirements need to accommodate for providers that determine certain type of mobility solutions appropriate for their commute, so they can go to do that. Which is not to say that we want to promote that, but we want to empower you to do that. So that's something that I think maybe some of you think is trivial, but to us, this is a line that we want to make it clear.
Our service is voluntary for the customer and is non-ADA. And so we're sort of waiting to see how the ride-sharing companies move in terms of meeting the threshold that will allow us to then start dispatching ADA trips. But in the meantime, I think we've been working closely and have made some good progress in terms of laying the groundwork for for that next stage. Our customers demanded a more stringent service animal policy, and that was implemented in Boston, then rolled out nationwide. Our customers asked for more transparency in terms of the cost of the trip up front, and that was provided to our customers and then rolled out nationwide. And then I think also we've seen both Uber and Lyft become much more responsive to the specific needs and demands of our customers in terms of training and onboarding. Whereas previously your average Uber and Lyft customer was very familiar with an app and a smartphone. Ours are not necessarily. So we've seen both companies really start to adapt and provide a higher level of service just as their base level, and that it becomes available to everyone across the country. So I think it's a matter of moving incrementally toward that key next stage where Uber and Lyft drivers then have the level of training and drug and alcohol testing to provide ADA trips.
And I agree. I love that question because it hits on exactly what we're talking about today. How does a TNC sort of adapt their business model to play in this space? And the same thing happens from the agency side as well. And you see movement in that area to be able to deliver those trips at the level that we know they need to be provided. One of the reasons why we did our Ride KC Freedom pilot with taxis is because the taxis in Kansas City are associated with TransDev, and they also do our paratransit contract already. So most of them are already trained. Our customers are already familiar with seeing a taxi show up, and the management there knows what the requirements are for our service. So we started there, and we'll keep an eye on what's going on with the TNCs as well, but we wanted to get something on the street that had the confidence already in place from people who had the experience with that service.
Sir, I think you have a question?
Good morning. My name is Abul Hassan. I'm the Director of Public Transportation from Anchorage, Alaska. I'm going to piggyback on that question and sort of dissect it a bit for our Uber representative on the panel. I'm curious as to whether you can explain what the cost modeling is. You talked about how you're looking at other services in terms of partnerships with other private entities to provide drivers and fleets. But currently, I'm assuming that the platform is being used and that you are utilizing your existing pool of partners in terms of drivers. How does the modeling work from a cost standpoint? Are you subsidizing it to where the drivers are simply getting what they would, $2 and change per mile, and you're providing a lower cost to the public? Or are drivers absorbing the cost to where you're doing sort of your surge pricing but reverse surging?
So I am not an expert in our pricing models by any means, but I do know that currently what we're doing with our wheelchair accessible vehicles, the driver partners get 100% of the earnings on the trip. So we don't take out a service fee for using the platform. And that's part of an incentive kind of structure that we're working with, and we're working to expand that as well and increase that to make it more attractive to ensure adequate supply. In terms of surge, wheelchair accessible vehicle, the WAVE programs that we have running throughout the country, they do not surge currently, and that's to ensure affordable rates, for our disabled communities. This, I think, is a very iterative process. As I mentioned, we're piloting, but I think there are so many things that we can try to kind of improve the options and increase supply. And I think a huge part of this is the incentives. It's providing an attractive opportunity for our driver partners. The commercial partnerships that we have some with taxi, we have some with kind of demand response partners across the country. I'm not positive what that price structure is, but we can connect after, and I can get an answer for you.
Thank you. And for my agency peers, my question would be, you talked a lot about sort of opportunity and sort of expediting the process itself. But what I didn't quite hear, and I'm hoping you can help me sort of understand, is who's assuming the liability? I mean, you talked about you're asking for background checks, but my experience suggests that those background tests are not the same tests that we put our own drivers through. So ultimately, if something goes wrong, who's assuming the liability? Is it Uber? Is it you as the entity? Or is it the driver?
We required anyone responding to our RFP to have $1 million of insurance covering all the trips, as well as accepting liability. We had our customers sign a waiver or an acknowledgement that this was not an MBTA-provided service, that this was a third party. We were simply providing the subsidy to make the trip more affordable. So that was our approach.
The service that we have now is done under an existing paratransit contract, so the liabilities are spelled out in that contract already on the provider side.
And then finally, from a funding standpoint, I think what I read between the lines is that Uber is subsidizing this as a pilot test from their own standpoint. Are you worried that as time progresses that your baseline might be reduced from a cost standpoint as an agency because the service is a lower cost, only to find out that the price goes up after the fact?
Our service isn't being subsidized any more than the normal Uber service. So obviously we have that concern industry-wide. What will, as time progresses, will the costs begin to change? But right now we also have such a large margin between what we're currently paying and what we're paying for a ride-sharing trip that even if there is a 50% increase, we're still going to be well below where we are with our dedicated model.
Thank you.
I wanted to move on to the notion of a traveler's complete trip, which can often involve multiple service providers, which raises the question of this payment system. Where in the industry right now with these partnerships, with the goal being a person just makes one payment and can use these multiple service providers, where are we in that sort of process?
We're not there in Kansas City. If somebody is, please let me know. I know that there are several different services that are working hard on it, and some may have gotten there. There's a service that we're sort of peaking at called Mobility as a Service Global that does that ties in through a subscription, allows you to access bus or taxi. That's not in the States at this point. My understanding is that there's intended to be a rollout. But that's the golden apple that needs to tie this together. It has to be easy for the customer on the front end, and then all the cost sharing and revenue sharing on the back end can look like a big pile of spaghetti. It doesn't matter. As long as the customer doesn't see that, right? And as long as we can get them from A to B seamless, that's the end stick. So we're not there. We're trying to drive towards that. But if anyone is, please catch me after, because we'd like to talk about that.
I'm assuming you're trying.
May I add to what Jameson just said? We actually noted this very important topic, payment. So through the draw from the 70A sandbox application, a lot of them propose, we want to develop an app that collect all the mobility resources into one app. Then the payment is still a critical factor that you have to address. Almost, I thinking like, it used to be like we go to, there's one way to do it, you go to individual restaurants, right? So you go to Italian, you go to French, you go to Japanese, and then you committed to that. Then somebody else said, well, why don't we have a food court, right? So you have all these areas, they all together, almost like the concept of one app, one place. You can decide, I may be in the mood of a pizza, I go to pizza. I may be able to pizza and ice cream. So it's all in one place. But when you check out and you trace, your ice cream, you got to pay there. Your pizza pay over here. So it's kind of like explain the current status in some systems. So payment is indeed a very important topic. And as FTA Office of Research, we are actually planning to reopen this dialogue. The reason why I say reopen, for those of you who are actually in the industry longer, or maybe even longer than I am, over 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even 20 years ago, there was a pretty active discussion about integrated payment, how we use technologies to facilitate this integrated seamless payment. And that conversation kind of taper off about 10 years ago, and at least from the FTA and the US DOT perspective, we kind of made the conclusion that, you know what, maybe there's really not much of a government role, so we're going to step back. Industry will make it happen because it's kind of complicated, banking industry, financial industry, and private industry will sort it out. But 10 years later, or 12 years later, that's where we are today, not really much happened, at least from our public transportation industry. So at the minimum, I like to reopen this dialogue. I don't know what we need to do. Maybe there's still no government role, but I like to reopen this dialogue given all this change occurred over the last 10, 12 years. I think it's a time for us, especially right now we're talking about integrated mobility. It's a time to have a conversation on integrated payment. I don't have a solution. I like to hear from your opinion. I think I have already talked to a number of you throughout the conference. I'd like to hear from you on this topic. But I think this is a topic that we need to look into again.
I think just to educate the audience, if you don't know how the payment structure works currently, at least with Uber and many of our public transit partners, there are primarily two options that we kind of give to a transit organization. One is a kind of a fixed fare discount. So usually the subsidy that a transit agency will give to the rider will be either fixed fare. So say the fare, they'll pay $5 of any fare, but it's fixed at that $5. So the rider, it's real time in the app. The rider will pay the difference, and then the transit agency would get a monthly invoice from us. The other option is a variable percentage discount. So the agency would pay, 20% of a given ride. And so that is calculated in real time in the app. So the rider will always know kind of what they're paying, what their discount is. And then again, we invoice monthly to the transit organization. I think one streamlined integrated payment system is definitely something that, we'd love to kind of partner with an agency to kind of do a pilot on something in that need with that in mind. But I think we're so new to the scene in terms of our relationships and our partnerships with public transit that we haven't really devoted a engineering team yet to kind of think about what that would look like. Maybe it's, the phone does everything and the rider just kind of goes in and instead of, tapping a smart trip in Washington, D.C., they would be tapping their phone, and it's all kind of integrated in one system. But I think there are a lot of technical aspects to that we haven't yet dived into, but very interested to make that experience more positive and seamless for the rider and the agency.
I think I have an audience question.
Good morning. My name is Ed Park. I'm from the RTC here in Reno, Nevada. I personally think this is one of the most important sessions of this week. And as Aptor was saying in the opening session, this may be the last bus conference. It may be called something else. And I think that indicates the focus of public transportation from fixed route service to partnering with ride sharing. But also, one thing that has been mentioned here is smart routing systems. Instead of buses going out on a determined schedule, on a determined route, actually having buses going out only when somebody calls a bus. And I think the current model of public transportation, fact of the matter is unsustainable. I think a lot of transit agencies in this room have realized that with the increasing cost of transportation, of healthcare, that the existing model is unsustainable, not just from a fiscal point of view, but also from a technological point of view. So my question is, what are transit agencies doing? And besides partnering with ride sharing, what are transit agencies doing to consider smart buses? And instead of cars going out like Uber and Lyft, having buses go out and picking up passengers only when they're being called?
Sure. Great question. We tried that recently. And we're going to try it again. I think that your point is your question is on point. If you think about the public transportation industry, and we each think about our agencies, and we think of it in terms of trips and market share, and we determine, okay, we've got, 50% market share, let's say. Let's use that. If we shrink that down and think of all the other possibilities, all the other transportation modes, connections, whatever, business models that exist, and shrink down our market share to its 10%, and then say, get back to 50 then you start to really open the door on what can we do, right? What role does a line haul route play into the system? What role does an on-demand microtransit sort of vehicle play into the system? We find that in Kansas City, there's a role for microtransit. It wasn't exactly the role that we used it under our pilot, but there is a role in conjunction with the business community. We have a lot of areas, not unlike other cities, where there are fulfillment centers coming in or warehousing coming in that are way off of the public transportation grid, but draw their workers from within the city core. And we have to figure out, how do we make that transition? Where does microtransit come in when the line haul traditional type of service fails, right? Where it's not economical, where does that come in? So we're starting to look at it in that context in those different areas. The buzz phrase now is mobility hubs, right? In those different areas on where that actually works. One of the interesting things for us is it's not just us taking an internal look at the agency. It's not just us tracking what the ridership numbers are. There's really an economic question to, is the region going to be sustained? Are we going to be able to sustain the growth that's coming into our region and be able to actually get people to work? The challenge isn't a hiring challenge. These companies can hire all day long. The challenge is actually connecting them to the front door. And when we take a look at how we traditionally deliver service, you're right. That's why we're looking at different service models. But really the context on when an on-demand bus or an Uber or a Lyft, or biking, bicycling has to be a part of it, pedestrian, what's the built environment that supports that goal of making those connections? So each of those pieces have to be looked at as well. So to answer your question, absolutely. I think the messaging from the APTA leadership yesterday signaled that mindset of a specific mode isn't really the path forward. The path forward is what's the right tool and the application of that tool.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that the lines between transit and paratransit will continue to blur over time. The T, we're taking our first step toward gaining control of that by bringing in-house or gaining control of our reservation, scheduling, and dispatch services. In a pitch, I have a panel on that tomorrow. It had previously been provided by our trip providers, and so now once we have control of that, we can start to then take a broader, more universal global look at our services, and as has been set up here, take a look at the trip request and then try and get to the most appropriate service to meet that demand.
Sounds like a good question.
Dave Turney, EEI Strategic Consulting, Dallas. When you take a person off the highway, with their vehicle off the highway, you satisfy one of the platforms of public transit, and that is congestion mitigation. With Uber or the like, arguably, you're just replacing that vehicle, maybe even adding to the number of vehicles. Would you talk about roadway congestion?
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, something we're really focused on and kind of interested in improving and working on is making every journey a shared journey, more efficient use of vehicles. So I think in the U.S., for every licensed driver, there's about 2 vehicles, which is pretty intense. That's a huge number. In most cities, parking space is about 30% of the city. And so kind of working on Uber Pool. So Uber Pool is a product that we match, 2 riders together, 2, 3, or 4. So I take Uber Pool to work in the morning, and I'm matched every day with 3 other people. So it's also, I've kind of used this service for quite some time now, and I was very frustrated with it. Last year when I lived in DC, because the route was never that efficient, and I'd be kind of driving in circles to get to where I wanted. But I've been so impressed in San Francisco, and obviously I'm biased, I work for the company now, but it's pretty impressive just to kind of get in that vehicle and realize that, oh my gosh, there are 4 people here that are taking 1 vehicle to get kind of in one spot. And that technology matching individuals based on the locations that they're requesting and the location that they're trying to get to is beyond me, but it's something that's really exciting. We came out in support of congestion road pricing a few weeks ago, something that that's done in London, Stockholm, and Singapore to great effect. I think it's something that will be very challenging in this country politically, but research has shown and studies have shown that by increasing road capacity, that's not the answer to necessarily congestion. That increasing the road capacity, more cars come onto the road. So putting a cost to driving, we think will incentivize sharing, will help congestion, will improve the health of a city and the experience of city dwellers. And I think that's also, road congestion pricing, Uber Pool. Uber Pool was, we developed it and launched it 2 years before we started with self-driving. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the priority is. And the priority for us is shared mobility. When you think about self-driving vehicles in the far future, it can go both ways. Robin Chase, the head of Zipcar, she kind of describes it as heaven or hell. So it can be, everyone can kind of move forward with this private car ownership model with their self-driving vehicle and send it to the grocery store to pick up their groceries and come back. But that to us, doesn't kind of reap the same benefits of more of a shared subscription-based model of self-driving vehicles. And so we are definitely thinking about congestion. It's a huge priority for us. Our Uber Pool product is now used in, so there's a 20% adoption rate in the cities that we operate Uber Pool in, and that is a huge growth rate from when we first started. So we're seeing this mass adoption. It's an affordable way to get somewhere. It's efficient, and it takes vehicles off the road.
I think we have time for just one more question, but we are quickly running out of time, so please.
Hi, Dave Tomczyk, Pace Bus, Suburban Chicago. On the transit side, it always seems good, innovative ideas always get bogged down when it gets to your legal department. And, it could carry on forever. So how did you overcome getting legal on board with a pilot program, getting all the FTA not slapping us for messing up, and the rules, the requirements, and all the regulations? And also, the subsidy from the transit, does it going to the passenger or is it going to the operator? And does that help or hurt the liability from a transit agency?
It's a good question. One of the ancillary benefits to starting a program like this, and this is a pitch to the transit agencies out there, is for us, having a program like this has had two real sort of unintended benefits. One is it's made it easier for us to attract talent and project managers to work on it. It's easier to hire someone for an innovation type job than it is for a traditional paratransit job. But it also attracted high-level attention as we were starting thinking about our pilot. Our governor, Charlie Baker, was proposing legislation to regulate TNCs. And so he pushed us to get the pilot up and running. So once we had that high-level support and high-level attention, it was much easier to move legal in the right direction toward the flexibility that we would need to implement this. So it's something that you can't underestimate the value of having sort of it was sort of three-headed effort of our customers, declaring that they wanted it. We had internal talent to help get it done, and then high-level attention. And so that combination really created an atmosphere where legal was helping us find solutions as opposed to throwing up roadblocks.
I think legal, HR, procurement, they all keep us out of minimum security jail, right? I mean, they're here. They're supposed to be the ones that pull you back before you step in anything. What we did in Kansas City was we used local funds to help get to market quicker, and that was satisfactory with the FTA, satisfactory with our board, satisfactory with our community. But what we did from there was really sort of open the door on how do we get innovation into the agency better. We borrowed a page from Boston and from Los Angeles and Dallas and others that have a policy within their procurement policy that allows for unsolicited proposals, that recognizes that a lot of the ideas coming to the agency are coming from outside the agency, from the private sector, from riders, from others. So we're able to get that incorporated into our procurement policy, and that was approved by that department and by legal. The other thing we were able to do was define pilot programs and how we were going to proceed with pilots. So we're able to put definitions into that and incorporate that into our procurement policy as well. So in that vein, we're able to work together to focus on how do we want to move forward to provide a solution, rather than what are all the 1,000 ways where we can pull this ideal back and not let it grow.
Well, I am afraid that is all the time we have for this session right now. I want to first say that there will be a brief announcement following this, but I want to say first, thank you to all of our panelists for this illuminating discussion. I'd like to give them a round of applause, so thank you very much. And in the meantime, I'd like to call up to the stage Joe Gibson of New Flyer and Chair of the Advisory Committee, and William Taylor, the Director of Bus Maintenance at MARTA. They have a announcement.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joe Gibson. I'm Vice President of National Sales with New Flyer and also Chair of the APTA Expo Advisory Committee. Who's ready to go to APTA Expo 2017? All right. Hey, mark your calendar now for October the 9th through the 11th and make plans to join us in Atlanta. Expo is the world's largest trade show for public transportation industry where you can achieve many goals. Number one, you can meet with over 800 industry-leading exhibitors showcasing our latest technologies and services in the industry. You can connect with over 12,000 plus industry peers to discover the effective and innovative solutions that are being offered in our businesses today. You can also expand your knowledge because the show floor is free. So it's free educational opportunity for you to visit with us and attend the APTA Expo in Atlanta. You'll learn to maximize your productivity and everything you need to see, touch, and explore all under one roof. Expo is truly the heart of innovation in our public transportation industry today. So please plan to join us in Atlanta and be one of the 1,000 of industry leaders attending this event for future of public transportation. Registration is now open. You can visit aptaexpo.com to complete your registration. And now a few words from our host from Atlanta, Mr. William Taylor, who's the Director of Bus Maintenance. Thank you very much. See you in Atlanta.
Good morning. Thank you, Joe. On behalf of the entire MARTA organization, we're excited to welcome you to Atlanta and share our great city with you. There are a couple of good things happening in Atlanta, or a lot of good things that are happening in Atlanta. A couple I'd like to mention is now we have expanded service into a southern portion of our metro Atlanta area, known as Clayton County. Secondly, we've also provided some transit expansion and enhancements in the city of Atlanta. And additionally, we offer fantastic MARTA rail service connectivity from our world's busiest airport and a major entry point into America via our red and gold rail service lines. We're working hard to make your experience at the 2017 annual meeting and expo a great one. Check the expo website on how you can give back to our community by bringing an extra business suit or dress for some deserving citizens. For those that have an abundance amount of clothing, here's a couple of rules of thumb that you could use if you haven't worn it in 12 months. If you can't fit it in anymore, clean it up and bring it to the expo with you so we can share those in our community. Now let's take a look at a video that we prepared to showcase MARTA and Atlanta. You have a lot to look forward to, and we are thrilled about the opportunity sharing our Southern hospitality with you. We'll see you in October.